It began, as so many cases did, with rain. Not the theatrical kind that blurs windshields and drowns conversation, but that thin, persistent drizzle that seeps into stone, softens sound, and lends Oxford a kind of meditative despair. I remember the street lamps along St. Giles that evening, halos of dim gold trembling on the wet pavement. I remember thinking how silence, too, has its own architecture, arches, echoes, and doorways that lead only inward. The call came at 9:30. Strange hour that, too late for civility, too early for confession. The voice on the line was Superintendent Dalton's, a man whose respect for literature ended with the racing post. "There's a death at Magdalen. Suspicious circumstances, though the college would rather call it an unfortunate accident." He said the word accident with the strained hope of a man pleading for it to be true. Magdalen College after dark has always reminded me of a ship, becalmed. Its quadrangles seemed to float, untethered, in a sea of fog. The porter, a narrow-eyed relic of stricter times, led me across the cloister. The echo of our footsteps made conversation seem indecent. Somewhere beyond, the chapel bell tolled the hour, and I felt that quiet tug, the one that always comes when a mystery begins, and the world seems briefly suspended between knowing and not. They had found the body in the Fellows' Library. A young Don, one of those bright but fragile types Oxford breeds so well, a lecturer in philology apparently, named Hugh Latham. He was slumped beside a long oak table, one arm outstretched, the other still clutching a glass that had rolled halfway to the floor. The library smelled of vellum, dust, and the faintest trace of spirits. Dalton murmured something about heart failure. I said nothing. It was not the body that drew my attention, but the air. There was something uneven about it, as if the silence itself had a pulse, erratic and shallow. On the table were several open books, one of them a dictionary of Middle English, another a thin volume of poems by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Between them a crossword puzzle lay half-finished. I have always trusted crosswords more than witnesses. People lie to protect themselves or sometimes to amuse the gods. Words, on the other hand, only deceive those who stop looking. The clue left unfinished was 6 letters, quiet form of knowing. 6, Latham had written the first 2 in, then nothing. The physician, a brisk man with the tidy despair of one long accustomed to Oxford tragedies, declared it was likely a seizure. Stress, overwork, perhaps a little too much whiskey. The usual litany. But when I leaned closer, I saw the rim of the glass was clean, untouched by lip or breath, and the bottle beside it, half empty, label smudged, bore a faint trace of something chalky near the cork. I asked if he'd been known to take medicine. No one could say. They rarely can. In my pocket, the crossword clue kept troubling me. Quiet form of knowing, insight. Too easy, intuit. Better, perhaps, but not 6 letters. Then it came in still, to introduce slowly, imperceptibly. Poison behaves much the same way. Outside, the drizzle had turned to mist. I stood beneath the archway that opens onto Addison's Walk, and thought of the word instill again. Knowledge, venom, guilt, all things that enter unseen. I felt the shape of the silence he'd left behind, and it was not the shape of peace. Dalton said they'd seal the library until morning. I agreed, though I doubted much would change by daylight. Death, after all, is most eloquent in the dark. As I walked away, I glanced back once through the narrow window pane. The lamplight fell across the desk, where the books still lay open like witnesses unsure whether to speak. I do not remember when I first noticed the missing bookmark. A trivial thing. A thin strip of red leather Latham was known to use. It should have been resting between the pages of his dictionary, yet it was gone, Later, when I found where it had been hidden, the case had already begun to turn, though I could not yet say how or why. That night, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and set the crossword on my desk. I filled in the word "instill" with slow precision. It fit perfectly, and as the rain whispered against the window, I realized the puzzle had only just begun to speak. By dawn, the rain had stopped, though the stones of Magdalen still sweated with it. The sky, the color of parchment left too long in the sun, seemed to promise neither comfort nor revelation. I arrived again before the city had fully woken, that strange hour when Oxford belongs only to the porters and the birds. The cloister was cordoned off with a perfunctory rope, as if modesty could conceal mortality. Latham's body had been removed, though the air retained a residue of him, the faint chemical bite of cleaning fluid failing to disguise something human, irreversible. I walked the circuit slowly, my footsteps soft against the flagstones. Every sound seemed to arrive late, as though unwilling to disturb the place's meditative decay. Dalton was waiting under the arch. He had the look of a man whose night had offered neither sleep nor revelation. He asked whether I believed it could still be an accident. I told him accidents have a different silence than this one felt curated. He frowned, unused to metaphor, and muttered something about waiting for the toxicology. We both knew what it would say. Inside the library, nothing had been moved. The books lay as before, the crossword untouched. I studied the table's surface, the arrangement of things so precise it seemed rehearsed. A man in crisis seldom tidies before dying. I asked the porter if Latham had been seen that evening. He recalled hearing footsteps around 8, light but measured, followed by the creak of the library door. Then silence. He had assumed someone was working late. Oxford runs on the assumption that solitude is scholarly, not suspicious. One of the shelves I noticed a volume missing Chaucer's Bose, the library's copy of the Consolation of Philosophy. A curious absence. Few would read it now, and fewer still at such an hour. Yet the ledger showed it had not been borrowed. Perhaps Latham had taken it without formality, perhaps it had been taken from him. Either way, it unsettled the symmetry of the room. I sat briefly in the chair he had occupied. It was not morbid curiosity, only the old compulsion to inhabit the geometry of the dead, to see what they might have seen before the world contracted to a single, unbearable fact. Through the narrow window, the quadrangle looked almost serene, framed by ivy and early light. Somewhere a bell began to ring for chapel, and the sound folded neatly into the stillness. Dalton reappeared with a small envelope in his hand. They'd found it wedged beneath a book on the next table. My name on the front, written in a hurried academic scrawl. He said it might be nothing, but I could hear the question behind his words. Why are you? Why always you? Inside was a single sheet of paper, torn from a notebook. No greeting, no signature, just one line. He said truth must wear silence like a cloak. I recognized the phrasing, though not the hand. A quotation, perhaps. Or an accusation. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket, saying nothing. Outside, the cloister glistened faintly where the sun found the puddles. A young fellow, one of Latham's students, lingered at the far end, feigning a cigarette he hadn't lit. His face was the kind Oxford specializes in, clever, uncertain, and already half weary of the truth. I asked if he'd spoken to Latham that day. He hesitated, then said the tutor had been distracted, preoccupied with some disagreement in the faculty. Something to do with an unpublished translation, though he didn't know the details. As he spoke, I watched his hand. He kept rubbing the edge of his cuff, a nervous habit, or a trace of guilt. Either way, it told me more than his words. When he turned to leave, I caught the faintest dusting of red leather on his sleeve. It could have been from a chair, or from something smaller. A bookmark, perhaps. By the time I reached the porter's gate, the chapel hymns had begun, voices rising into the cold air, earnest and imperfect. I paused to listen, though faith has never been my refuge. There is a peculiar honesty in those unsteady notes, a kind of human arithmetic. For a moment I almost envied their certainty. Then the music ended, and Oxford returned to silence, its truest and most persistent language. There are places in Oxford that seem to bend time, as though the centuries fold quietly over one another, like pages pressed together by use. The senior common room at Magdalen was one of them, a circle of warmth, tobacco, and low conversation, where truth was always the least welcome guest. I sat there that afternoon, a reluctant participant in civility, watching the rain draw. Half-moons on the leaded windows. They were talking of Latham, of course, not with sorrow, but with that muted relish peculiar to the academic conscience, the satisfaction of tragedy dressed in intellectual fabric. A man from the faculty of classics murmured that it was all rather inevitable brilliance, solitude, obsession, the old Trinity. Another, his collar faintly wine-stained, added that Latham had been difficult lately. Something about a dispute over authorship. I listened, as I always do, to what was not being said. When I asked who his rivals might have been, the conversation thinned. One name emerged reluctantly: Dr. Merian, a linguist of some acclaim, though his reputation had weathered better than his conscience. They had been collaborating on a translation, apparently, until Latham accused him of theft, of appropriating his research without acknowledgement. The others shrugged. Such accusations were common in the slow violence of academia. I thought of that missing boast, of consolation and its discontents. Afterward, I found Merian in his room overlooking the cloister. He was marking essays, a cigarette trembling slightly between his fingers. The room smelled of dust and ink and something faintly medicinal. He said he was surprised to see me, though not displeased. I told him I wanted to understand what had passed between him and Latham. His eyes moved to the window, then to the floor. He said there had been disagreement, yes, but only the sort born of excessive pride in Latham's, not his own. I did not argue. The truth rarely survives its first telling. There was a book open on his desk, The Consolation of Philosophy, the same edition missing from the library. He noticed me noticing it. He said it was his own copy, a coincidence. I asked whether he believed in coincidence. He smiled thinly, a curve of lips without amusement, and said Oxford was built upon them. I took his word for it. Still the volume's spine bore the library's insignia, faded but clear. When I rose to leave, he handed me something, a folded piece of paper he claimed to have found in his pigeonhole that morning. Another fragment, written in the same slanted hand as the first note. The circle closes where the corner begins. I asked if he knew what it meant. He said it sounded like Latham, always chasing paradoxes. I agreed, though I was not so sure. As I crossed the quadrangle, the afternoon light fell unevenly across the stones, as if the sun itself were uncertain of its place. I stopped beneath the cloister arch, where the shadows formed perfect right angles, then softened again into curves, circles and corners, the geometry of confinement and escape. I took out the note, reading it again. There was something mathematical about it, but also human, the way all good puzzles are. Later in my office I spread both notes before me. Truth must wear silence like a cloak. The circle closes where the corner begins. Together they seemed less cryptic, more deliberate, the kind of symmetry that only a mind on the brink of something unbearable would design. I drew a small diagram on my blotter, a circle intersecting a square, and realized it was the ancient symbol for harmony between reason and soul. The quadrivium and the trivium, the meeting of intellect and instinct. Latham, the philologist, would have known that. Perhaps he had tried to express it one last time before his words deserted him. The night descended with the hesitant grace of forgiveness. I poured a measure of whiskey, turned off the lamp, and watched the smoke curl upward in thin, uncertain spirals. Somewhere in the college the bell struck 9, the same hour I had first heard his name. I thought of Merion's cigarette, trembling in the half-light, of the red leather dust on the student's sleeve, of the missing bookmark that was no longer missing, but merely misplaced in meaning. There are patterns in everything, if one has the patience to listen. Circles, corners, and the silence that binds them. Oxford has always known this, even if its inhabitants prefer to pretend otherwise. That night I found myself staring at my diagram until the lines began to blur, until the circle no longer enclosed the square but slipped quietly beyond it, as though even geometry, when pressed, longed to escape its own perfection. There are moments in a case when the world seems to tilt quietly, imperceptibly, until all that once appeared ordered begins to slide into shadow. For me, it began with a photograph of an old one, slightly faded, the edges curling as if reluctant to let go of what it once knew. It had been tucked into the back of a book among Latham's possessions, discovered by the college secretary who brought it to me with the caution of someone handling both evidence and gossip. 3 figures stood in the picture, 2 men and a woman. The men I recognized, Latham and Merion, both younger, their faces untouched by the fatigue that comes from years of teaching minds that believe they already know. The woman, though she was a mystery, pale, poised, and faintly amused, as if the world's secret were a private joke shared only between herself and the photographer. Her hand rested lightly on Latham's arm, yet her gaze belonged elsewhere. I spent longer than I should have, studying that face. There was something about the set of her mouth, the unguarded intelligence behind the eyes. I had seen her somewhere, though perhaps not in life. Memory has a way of inventing familiarity, especially in Oxford, where faces repeat through generations like motifs in old stained glass. Dalton thought it irrelevant, some past entanglement, best left to the college gossip. He said men like Latham always had a muse, or fancied they did. I told him inspiration was seldom fatal. He didn't answer. We'd long since agreed on the futility of argument. Later that evening, I returned to Latham's rooms. They had been stripped of their more personal traces, but something remained, that faint perfume of paper and solitude. On his desk stood a silver frame, empty. The dust along its edges formed a perfect rectangle. The missing photograph, I thought. I looked toward the bookshelf and saw the indentation where it must have rested. Even absence leaves a shape. Among the books was a small notebook, its spine cracked, pages filled with half-legible notes, references to Chaucer, fragments of Latin, and one name written several times, E. Merion. Not the linguist, but someone else, a relation perhaps. I checked the faculty register later and found nothing. Yet when I asked around, one of the porters recalled a woman who had visited the college often in the previous term, elegant, quiet, always asking for Dr. Merion. She had stopped coming a few weeks before Latham's death. That night I dined alone in Randolph, as I often do when thought requires its own company. The photograph lay beside my plate, half concealed beneath a folded napkin. I turned it over once, idly, and saw faint writing on the back pencil, almost erased, to remember the beginning before the words broke. It sounded like Latham, or perhaps it was hers. Either way, it spoke of endings disguised as origins. I left early and walked through Broad Street, the rain beginning again, that fine Oxford drizzle that blurs the outlines of everything it touches. Near Sheldonian, I passed a print shop still faintly lit. In the window hung a display of college portraits and group photographs. There, in the bottom corner of one, I found her again. Same face, same composure. This time labelled in neat script Eleanor Merion, Assistant Lecturer, 1987-1990. The shopkeeper, a man whose eyes had grown small from years of peering through glass, remembered her, said she'd left suddenly, no forwarding address, something about a scandal that was never quite confirmed. I thanked him, though I already knew how the rest of the story would go. Oxford forgets its women easily, especially those who remind it what it prefers not to see. Back in my flat, I placed the photograph under the lamplight beside the two notes. Truth must wear silence like a cloak. The circle closes where the corner begins. I studied the woman's eyes again, and it struck me that she was not looking at either of the men beside her, but just beyond them toward something unseen, or perhaps unremembered. It was then I noticed the faint reflection on the glass. In the background of the photograph behind the trio was a wall lined with books, and among them a single title legible enough to read Bose. The same missing volume, a coincidence perhaps, but I have never believed in coincidence. The past, like a photograph, does not fade evenly. Some faces remain clear, while others dissolve into the paper. And somewhere in the space between the two, a truth waits patiently, unspoken, and quietly unbearable. It was the kind of morning Oxford does best, grey, meticulous, and faintly accusatory. The sort of light that makes truth seem both too close and too far to touch. I arrived at Magdalen just after 8, the echo of my own steps the only sound in the quadrangle. The air had the smell of damp stone and resignation. They were holding an academic hearing in the senior common room, the polite euphemism for what was, in essence, a public unburdening. Merion had demanded it, though whether out of pride or desperation, I could not yet tell. He wished to clear his name of plagiarism, to remind his peers that intellect, like innocence, prefers to speak for itself. I took a seat in the back, an uninvited observer, which suited me well enough. The panel consisted of 3 men who looked as though they had spent their lives defending Latin rather than hearing it. Their expressions hovered between boredom and mild distaste, the moral range of the British Academy. Merion sat alone at a long table, pale, self-contained, his papers arranged with almost military precision. When he began to speak, his voice had that careful calm one acquires only after a sleepless night. He spoke of research shared and misinterpreted, of drafts borrowed and returned, of notes once co-authored in good faith. Each sentence seemed carved from exhaustion. He never mentioned Latham's name directly, but it trembled beneath the surface like a submerged wire. When one of the panel asked about the translation the one Latham had accused him of stealing, Merion paused. He said the work was unfinished, and perhaps it always would be. I saw his hands tremble then, not from fear, but from memory. During recess, I wandered to the corridor outside. The walls were lined with portraits of scholars, poets, benefactors, their painted eyes steeped in centuries of indifference. The silence there had weight, the kind that collects in old buildings and old arguments. I thought again of Eleanor Merion, the woman in the photograph. Sister? Wife? The university records gave no answer. Only a line in an old departmental circular mentioning her resignation on grounds of health. When the hearing resumed, I noticed a curious detail. Among the papers on Merion's desk lay a folded handkerchief embroidered with the letter E. He used it once to dab at his forehead, then quickly replaced it, as though embarrassed by its presence. It was the kind of gesture one forgets to hide when already burdened by too many others. The proceedings ended without conclusion. The panel would deliberate, meaning they would postpone the discomfort of decision for as long as possible. Merian left before anyone could speak to him. I followed at a distance, not from suspicion, but instinct that quietly pulled toward something unsaid. He crossed the cloister and stopped beneath the same arch where Latham's body had once lain. He stood there for a long moment, head tilted upward, as though listening for a voice that no longer spoke. I approached him then, slowly. I asked about the photograph. He said he hadn't thought of it in years. I told him it had been found among Latham's things. That caught him. He looked at me with something between anger and recognition. He said Eleanor had been his wife once, that she'd left Oxford after the affair was not scandal exactly, but grief uncontained. Latham had loved her foolishly and too well. She had loved neither of them, or perhaps both, in the abstract way some minds love ideas. There was a pause. Then he said something I still remember, though I'm not sure why. "Knowledge," he murmured, "doesn't redeem us. It only makes the guilt articulate." As he turned to leave, a small notebook slipped from his coat pocket. I picked it up, intending to return it, but he had already gone. On the open page was a single phrase written in Latham's hand. To defend is to confess in another language. That night I read the words again under the dim light of my flat. Outside, the rain began once more, tapping gently against the glass like a cautious visitor. I thought of defence and confession, of circles and corners, of truths that do not absolve but merely endure. Oxford, too, is full of such polished, unspoken and quietly waiting to be rediscovered. Betrayal is a quiet thing. It rarely announces itself with shouting or blood. More often it arrives like a whisper in the mind, a faint rearrangement of what one thought immutable. That was how it began for me, that slow dislocation between fact and feeling. The equation had been building for days, the variables too human to balance. The morning after the hearing, I received word that Dr. Merian had been found unconscious in his room. Not dead yet, but close enough for it to matter. The porter who discovered him said the gas fire had been left on without ignition. An accident, perhaps. But Oxford's accidents, I've found, tend to occur only when convenience demands them. The hospitals smelled of antiseptic and dread. Merian lay beneath a thin blanket, his skin the colour of parchment, his breath uncertain. A nurse hovered near the bed, her eyes conveying the particular sympathy reserved for those who are not expected to recover. I asked if he had spoken. She said only one word before slipping back into silence. It was late afternoon when Dalton joined me. He looked tired in the way men do when duty collides with comprehension. He said they'd found a note in Merian's desk, half-burned, illegible, but for one line it wasn't meant for him. Dalton thought it a confession. I wasn't so sure. Oxford breeds ambiguity the way orchards breed rot, inevitably and often beautifully. Back at the college, I walked the perimeter of the cloister once more. The rain had stopped, leaving small constellations in the puddles. In the corner where Latham had died, a single leaf floated in still water, unmoving despite the breeze. I found myself staring at it longer than reason allowed. Circles and corners again, the geometry of guilt. Later in the library, I returned to the books. The missing Bose had been quietly replaced on its shelf, as though the dead tidied after themselves. Inside the cover, I found a slip of paper folded twice. It bore a short passage underlined in pencil. "No man is wretched save he who believes himself so." Latham's hand, without question. But what struck me most was the faint impression of other writing pressed into the page as though something had been written atop it and later torn away. I shaded the surface with the side of my pencil. Slowly a word appeared. Eleanor. I left the library and walked toward the river. Evening had begun to fall and the sky over Magdalen Tower turned the colour of old silver. The air was heavy with the scent of whetstone and the faint metallic trace of decay. I thought of Marian lying between consciousness and surrender, of Latham's meticulous despair, of Eleanor, the woman whose absence seemed more articulate than any presence. At the boathouse I saw a figure sitting on the bench overlooking the water. Eleanor. There was no doubt this time. Her hair, darker now, gathered loosely at her neck. Her hands clasped in her lap, motionless. When I approached, she said she'd expected me sooner. Her voice carried that same inflection as the notes, weary, measured, unwilling to be fully known. She said she had returned because she'd read of Latham's death, that she hadn't meant for things to go so far, that she'd warned him but he wouldn't listen. I asked what she had warned him about. She smiled faintly as though I'd mistaken the question for poetry. She said love, like translation, is never exact. Someone always loses meaning. I told her Marian was dying. She didn't flinch, though her hand tightened slightly on the bench. She said he had loved her once, perhaps still did, but it had become a kind of algebra, all symbols, no feeling. Equations written to justify pain. I asked whether she had seen him before the hearing. She said no, though her eyes moved to the water when she spoke. That, more than denial, was enough. When she left, she did not say goodbye. I watched her walk across the meadow, her figure dissolving into mist. It struck me then that every tragedy in Oxford seems to end the same way, someone walking away beneath the tolling of distant bells, the air too damp for comfort, the truth too late for rescue. That night I returned to my flat and poured the last of the whiskey. On my desk lay the crossword from Latham's room, the word instill still circled in my own handwriting. Quiet form of knowing. Knowledge poured in, drop by drop, until the vessel cracked. Forgive, he had said. But forgiveness, like algebra, is only possible when all parts are known. And in Oxford, nothing ever truly adds up. There is a peculiar cruelty in clarity. It arrives without warning, stripping every illusion bare, and in its wake comes the silence of that final, unanswerable witness. I remember that night vividly, the way one remembers an ache rather than an event. The air outside was thin and sharpened by frost. Oxford had settled into that hush peculiar to December evenings when the city seemed to be listening to itself breathe. I had returned to the library, though the investigation had been all but closed. Dalton believed the case solved in its essentials: despair, guilt, unbalanced genius. He'd said it with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose conclusions shield him from doubt. But I have never trusted neatness. It too often conceals something fragile beneath. The light in the library was dim, the lamps shrouded in their green glass shades. Dust floated in the air like forgotten punctuation. I sat at Latham's old table, his books still aligned in their unspoken order. I drew out the beau essai again and turned to the underlined passage I had read before. Beneath it, the faint pencil indentation remained the one that spelled Eleanor. But there was something else I had not noticed until that night. The curve of the E, faintly smudged, crossed another line of pressure running diagonally through the page. An equation. It wasn't mathematical in the strict sense, more a cipher, perhaps a habit, from Marian's teaching days. Letters stood where numbers might have been. L, M, and E, their initials, a triangle of meaning. I copied it down and out of long habit, began to treat it as I would a crossword, the simplest relationships first. L plus E equals M, the algebra of betrayal rendered in ink. I sat there for a long while, the radiator ticking faintly, the smell of damp leather rising from the bindings. Betrayal, yes, but by whom? Of whom? When all three names form one equation, the sum is seldom what it seems. It was near midnight when the door creaked open and the porter entered, startled to find me there. He carried a parcel, brown paper bound with string. "Found this in Dr. Merion's pigeonhole, sir," he said. "Thought it best you see it." The handwriting on the label was firm, deliberate. "For Inspector Morse, to be opened privately." Inside was a single photograph, the same one I had seen before, but not quite. This version had been altered, the woman's face scratched out carefully, almost tenderly. On the reverse, written in Merion's hand, were 3 words: "The proof lies." I studied the phrasing. Proof lies, the ambiguity was deliberate. Proof as noun, proof as verb. Either the evidence deceives or the evidence itself has lied. Perhaps both. I went to the Fellows' Common Room, where the remnants of the hearing still lingered, the half-erased chalk notes on the board, the stale scent of smoke and debate. On the mantelpiece stood a framed certificate of the committee's final report on Latham and Merion's translation. I looked closer. Beneath the typed signatures was a faint watermark visible only against the firelight. E. Merion. Not Eleanor. Edward. The initials on the equation turned themselves inside out. Latham, Merion, and Eleanor were never the full story. There was a fourth element, the unseen brother perhaps, or an author hidden behind the public name. The E might have been Edward all along, and the cipher his way of reclaiming what he'd lost to another's vanity. The proof then was false, the evidence arranged to point toward the wrong betrayal. I left the building just before dawn. The frost had stiffened into crystal patterns on the grass, precise as geometry, merciless as reason. A bell struck 6, and its echo carried across the quadrangle, low and hollow. I lit a cigarette and thought of Latham's crossword again, a quiet form of knowing. I had solved it once as instill, but now I wondered if the truer answer was inward. Knowledge drawn too deep can turn poisonous. In seeking proof, one disturbs what proof was meant to bury. Perhaps Merion had understood at last why he'd chosen the gas, the silence, the note that confessed nothing, yet contained everything. The false proof wasn't his alone. It belonged to all of us who prefer order to truth. I dropped the cigarette and watched it die on the stones. Above me, the first faint light gathered, pale and unwilling. Oxford would wake soon, unaware of the equation still unresolved in its walls. Some mornings, I tell myself, I left it unfinished on purpose. Other mornings, I know it finished me instead. There are moments when a case ceases to be an investigation and becomes, instead, an act of remembering not merely the facts, but the spaces between them, the quiet intervals where truth hides itself like dust between book pages. The symmetry of lies is its own kind of beauty, I've found. The more perfect it appears, the more it begins to collapse under its own precision. By then, the newspapers had lost interest. The college, ever discreet, had issued its statement, a tragic series of misunderstandings, the untimely death of a scholar much admired, another left in fragile health. The university moves quickly to forget, as all institutions do when guilt becomes inconvenient. But I could not forget. The pieces still refused to fit, and I have never been able to leave a puzzle half finished. It was a Thursday when the final fracture appeared. I had returned to Merion's rooms officially to collect some papers for the coroner, though in truth I went because something there had been troubling me, a faint asymmetry, a pattern I had seen but not understood. The fire had been cleaned, the books realigned, the small comforts of academia restored. But the wall above the desk still bore a faint discoloration, a square outline slightly lighter than the rest. Something had hung there once. I searched through the drawers until I found a framed certificate, the same one I'd seen in the Fellows' Common Room. Merion's Fellowship Award dated 2 years earlier. Only this copy had a faint crease along the bottom as if it had once been folded around something smaller. When I eased the backboard open, a photograph slipped out. Not the one I knew. This was older, softer in tone. Latham and Eleanor again, but this time Merion stood apart, slightly blurred, as though he had moved at the moment the shutter clicked. Behind them, written faintly on the wall, were 2 Latin words, fidem fractum. Broken faith. I turned the photograph over. On the reverse, in Latham's hand, was a line I recognized from Bose: the chain of love binds all things unless broken by will. I sat for a while, letting the air settle. That was the missing symmetry, not who loved whom, but who broke the circle first. Love, betrayal, scholarship, the old triad again. But beneath it all, there had been calculations. The lies were not improvised, they were composed. Later, in the master's study, I asked to see the correspondence between Merion and Latham regarding the translation. It took some persuasion, and perhaps a touch of irony. Oxford values privacy above virtue. Among the letters was one that had been misfiled, dated a month before Latham's death. Merion's tone was cold, almost surgical. He accused Latham of falsifying sources, of inserting phrases that did not exist in the original text. Symmetry for its own sake, he wrote, is deception, masquerading as art. That was when I saw the word symmetry. The title of Latham's final lecture, the last he never delivered. The lecture that Eleanor had helped him write. The symmetry of lies. I began to suspect the translation had been their private dialogue, each line a cipher between intellect and desire. But someone had rewritten it, replaced passages, altered meanings, the academic equivalent of poisoning a glass. When I left the college that evening, the bells were sounding for evensong. Their echoes trailed through the mist, like voices too weary to finish their sentence. On the river path I found Eleanor waiting, or perhaps she had simply known I would come. She said she'd read the reports that Oxford had made its peace. I told her peace and forgetting were never the same thing. She said Latham's death had not been her doing. I said I believed her, though belief is a word I've never trusted. We stood there for a long time, watching the river move without direction. She asked whether Merion had survived. I told her he had, though barely. She nodded once, as if that were the natural conclusion. Then she said something so quiet I might have imagined that truth, like translation, loses shape when too many hands touch it. When she walked away, I looked down at the river again. Its surface reflected the college towers upside down, perfectly symmetrical. I thought of the forged translation, the altered words, the rearranged affections, the way the false image always seems clearer than the true one. That night, I sat at my desk with the final page of Latham's notes. The last line read, "All proofs are temporary." Beneath it, in Eleanor's hand, was a single correction. "So are lies." And there, perhaps, the symmetry broke at last. Some objects lie to us more gently than people ever could. A compass, for instance, will always pretend to know where it's going. Even when it's broken, it points somewhere only, not where it should. That, I think now, was the shape of the case, a steady needle, beautifully wrong. I had left Oxford for a few days after the inquest, though not for rest. Rest is impossible when one carries unfinished symmetry in the mind. I took a room in Woodstock, overlooking the small square where market stalls fold themselves like thoughts at dusk. It was there, among the muffled sound of the wind and the smell of damp tobacco, that I tried to make sense of what remained. Latham died. Marian survived but was silent. Eleanor vanished again, or perhaps merely absorbed by the city's indifference. It should have been conclusion enough, yet something continued to turn inside me, slowly, like that damaged needle seeking north through interference. I went back to Magdalen on the 5th day. The porter greeted me with a polite reluctance, the sort Oxford reserves for those who disturb the past. He said they were packing Latham's belongings for the archives. His tone implied an ending, but endings, like truth, are never official. The Fellows' Library was quiet, as always, its long windows filtering the pale winter light into bands that looked almost solid. On Latham's desk, among the orderly stacks of papers, I noticed a small wooden box I hadn't seen before. The lid bore an engraving of a compass rose delicately carved, but its north point fractured a thin line splitting the grain. Inside lay a pocket compass, brass, old, the glass cracked. Beneath it, a slip of paper in Latham's hand. Direction is a form of faith. It was a strange thing for him to have written. Latham, the philologist, the eternal skeptic, had little use for faith. Yet here it was, his last private relic, an emblem of navigation and error. I held the compass in my palm. The needle quivered, then came to rest, pointing neither north nor south, but east, toward the college chapel. Perhaps it was nothing, and yet I have never trusted coincidences in Oxford. I followed the line of its misdirection. The chapel stood empty, its air still and dust-moted. I walked the length of the nave, my footsteps echoing softly. At the far end, near the choir stalls, a side door stood ajar. Beyond it, a narrow stair curved downward into the undercroft. Few went there now. The air changed as I descended, cooler, faintly metallic. The walls were lined with old storage cabinets, the kind that hold records no one has the courage to destroy. One drawer bore the label Private Correspondence, 1985-190. I opened it. Inside, a folder marked E. Marian. The letters were written in the same elegant, deliberate hand as the notes I'd found before. They began formally, then unravelled into something rawer, half intellectual discourse, half confession. They spoke of translation not as scholarship, but as salvation of language as the only means to survive betrayal. And then, in the last, a phrase that altered everything. If he alters the text again, the poison will not remain, only in words. Poison! The word lingered. The physician had mentioned traces of an unknown compound in Latham's system, dismissed as contamination from the glass. But what if it had not been carelessness? What if the translation had not merely been forged, but weaponized? An intellectual feud turned chemical, one last scholarly correction enacted in flesh. I locked the drawer again and stood listening to the hollow quiet. From above came the faint toll of the chapel bell's 6 strokes, though I could have sworn I'd heard 7. I climbed the stairs, the compass still in my pocket, the needle trembling as if it too had begun to suspect something. Outside, the evening was folding itself across the quadrangle. The air tasted of cold metal and rain. I stood beneath the tower, thinking of directions north that was not north, love that was not love, proof that lied even while pretending to guide. Oxford has always thrived on false compasses. It calls them theories, reputations, legacies. Later, back in my flat, I set the compass on my desk beside the empty whiskey glass. The needle had finally stilled. I couldn't tell where it pointed anymore, perhaps nowhere at all. I thought of Latham's inscription, "Direction is a form of faith, but faith, I have learned, is only useful when one is willing to be lost." There are patterns to grief angles, distances, the faint repetition of loss. I have come to think of remorse as a kind of geometry, its lines crossing the same points, no matter where one begins. The difference lies only in who draws the final shape. It was February when I was called to the hospital for the last time. Marion had died in the early hours, quietly, without request or forgiveness. The nurse told me he had been calm in his final days, though he spoke little. His belongings fit in a single box, a fountain pen, a notebook, and the broken compass I had left on his bedside table weeks earlier. She asked whether I'd known him well. I said I'd known him precisely, which is not the same thing. The notebook contained translations, fragments of Bose, interspersed with what seemed like personal annotations. At first glance, they were unremarkable philosophical musings on fate, consolation, and the illusion of freedom. But one passage caught me, a line circled twice in his uneven hand. We are not punished for our sins, but by them. Beneath it, in smaller letters, someone else had written E.M., not Edward Marion, but Eleanor. Her hand finer, the ink older. The translation, it seemed, had become their confession, a dialogue in the guise of scholarship. I walked from the hospital through the sleet, the city suspended between thaw and frost. Oxford looked exhausted by its own endurance, the spires blurred against the low clouds like thoughts that refused to be articulated. I crossed the bridge toward Magdalen, though I wasn't sure. Why? Habit, perhaps, or something quieter. The porter nodded as I entered the gate. They were dismantling Latham's old rooms when at last the archivists had arrived, precise and joyless, armed with gloves and catalogues. The air smelled of polish and erasure. I asked to be left alone for a while. The younger of them hesitated, then obeyed. Even bureaucracy yields to grief when it carries an air of authority. The room looked smaller than I remembered. The desk, bare now, bore faint impressions where papers had lain. The window still rattled slightly when the wind shifted. I sat in his chair and unfolded Marion's notebook again. Between 2 pages, a folded letter had been hidden. No envelope, no date. Only a salutation. My dear H, and a single paragraph that could have been written yesterday or years ago. If truth is a compass, then remorse is its twin. One points outward, the other inward. Together they form a circle from which there is no escape. I do not know if Latham wrote it to her or she to him. Perhaps it no longer mattered. Remorse, like geometry, depends only on relation, not origin. Still, something in that phrasing stirred a faint deduction. Twin compasses. The image was too deliberate, too mathematical to be poetic. I took the broken compass from the notebook's box and studied it again. The crack across its face had deepened. The glass felt loose beneath my thumb. Gently I pried it open. Inside the lid, under a thin layer of tarnish, a second needle lay hidden, smaller, rusted, fixed in the opposite direction, not broken after all, but divided. 2 norths cancelling one another, direction undone by symmetry. That then was Latham's private metaphor and Marion's ruin. A partnership that could not hold a single truth, a translation that meant 2 things at once, a love that pointed both toward and away from itself. The geometry of remorse, indeed. As I left the room, I noticed the reflection of my own figure in the window pane, doubled against the glass. For a moment I could not tell which image was mine, the one within or the one beyond. The difference, I thought, is only perspective. Oxford has always lived by such illusions that what appears transparent is merely another surface waiting to distort. Outside, the rain had returned. I walked along the cloister, past the chapel where Latham's memorial plaque had already been installed. The inscription was short, decorous, and wrong. It named him as a man devoted to truth and language. I thought of the poison, the forged translation, the quiet cruelty of intellect. Devotion, perhaps. But to what? Later that night, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and placed the compass beside the glass. The two needles quivered faintly, drawn toward nothing. I tried to imagine what it might feel like to live without direction, not lost exactly, but suspended between destinations. Perhaps that is what remorse truly is, not guilt, but motion without progress. I opened Merian's notebook one last time and read the line again. We are not punished for our sins, but by them. Beneath it, I added a note of my own, a kind of postscript, though no one would ever read it. And sometimes by the silence that follows them. When I closed the book, I felt the faintest tremor of completion, not resolution, but rest. Outside, Oxford slept beneath its ancient geometry circles of blame, triangles of love, and the endless compass of remorse turning forever inward,